He's a leading scholar of criminal justice outcomes from Duke University. Please welcome Brendan Garrett.
Great, thank you. It's great to be here. So I'm not a scientist of any kind. I'm a lawyer and a law professor at Duke. I do work on a number of different aspects of the criminal system. I teach evidence, right? I'm teaching evidence right now, and forensic evidence certainly comes up quite a bit when you teach the rules of evidence. There's me. I wrote a book called Autopsy of a Crime Lab, which came out a little over a year ago, and the idea was to dig into the issues that face crime lab work, the types of forensics that we use in court in criminal cases. And so somewhat distinct from some of the things we've been hearing about tonight where you're trying to identify why did someone die, who is that person, the questions become more pointed when you're in a courtroom and the stakes involve life and liberty for a defendant. And there are public safety concerns, obviously. You want to bring the correct person to justice. I do other work. I do a lot of work tracking data on plea bargaining. We're doing these pilots around the country trying to document the plea bargaining process. So most cases don't go to trial. In most cases, you're not going to have an expert on the stand explaining what they did in the crime lab. Instead, the parties are going to look at some documents and plead a case out. That happens, in 90+% of felony cases in this country. And so it makes it all the more important that we know that the evidence is reliable, because most cases won't actually be looked at that carefully. They will not see much light in a courtroom. They will be negotiated in the hallways through the kind of sausage making of the plea bargaining process. I also do a lot of work on bail reform. I'm the court monitor in a misdemeanor bail reform consent decree in Houston. A lot of people spend a lot of time in jail before they are proven guilty. People are innocent until proven guilty, but that doesn't mean you won't be put in jail pre-trial. And so the criminal system is complicated. The focus tonight is on forensic evidence. Just an example of a case I wanted to highlight for you was a case that came across my desk when I was researching cases of people who were later freed by post-conviction DNA testing. So we later learned that they were innocent. And I was asked by the national academies to report to them on these DNA exoneree cases. And although they were freed by DNA, often at the time of their original trial in the 1980s, they were convicted based on forensics too. Often more traditional forensics, whether it was hair comparisons or blood typing or fingerprints. Later DNA set them free, but traditional forensics helped to put them as innocent people in prison in the first place. In my work looking at these old trials to figure out what went wrong in these innocent people's cases, I also wanted to see, because most of the time, you could see even just reading the trial transcripts that these people were saying quite unscientific things about the evidence. They were exceeding the bounds of the science. Rather than say these hairs look kind of similar, they would say these hairs are a match. And there's no research on how you can match hair. These weren't DNA tests. These were much less precise sort of observations by people who are relying on their skill and experience to make observations. And so I looked at many dozens of random trials in several of the states just to see, did we see the same things? One of the trial transcripts I came across just by random, it wasn't a DNA exoneree, it wasn't a case that had any particular meaning to me, was the case of Keith Harward. And it just jumped out because there aren't that many criminal cases that you come across regularly where there are bite marks that are examined. I've had kids that bit me, but in terms of homicidal biters, that's not frequent, but it's frequent enough that there are forensic odontologists, and that is kind of what they do for a living in addition maybe to their dental practice. And here, there were two dentists who testified in a death penalty case in Virginia, one of whom said, not just match, but it was very, very, very likely that the defendant, Keith Harward's teeth made the marks on the victim. The three varies must be a very high percentage. The second dentist said just that his teeth made those marks. Now, I didn't know this when I read the trial, but that he had written a letter to the Innocence Project. He was still in prison. Later, DNA testing was done in his case. 33 years after his conviction, he was exonerated, and the DNA matched someone else who was on the giant Navy carrier where he was a sailor. There he is in his sailor's uniform. There were a lot of people on that boat. It was off Newport News, the USS Carl Vinson. They actually did a dental dragnet and had hundreds of these sailors open their mouths because they had in mind that this must have been a biter. The victim's thighs were bitten. She lived, but she couldn't describe the person. Her husband was beaten to death by this intruder. It was a very high-profile case in 1983 in Virginia. And so they do this dental dragnet, and they look at everyone's teeth on the boat, and they come up with nothing. A year later, Keith Harward is in a dispute with his girlfriend, which was somewhat violent. She's scratching his face, he bites her arm. It wasn't a good behavior all around, but the police had this idea that, oh, now we found our biter. And so they show his molds back to the dentist and say, we think this is a biter. And they look at it again and say, oh, well, we excluded them the last time, but no, now we're sure, now it's a match. So you can sort of see the cognitive bias at work, and it's a highly subjective discipline. It's not clear, like, how many marks do you have to have in common? Like, what are the positions? How many things in the teeth do you have to see that line up to say that it's a bite match? No particular information about that. They just sort of are lining things up and reaching conclusions. The National Academy of Sciences, by the time of Harward's release, had concluded in a report that none of these pattern matching disciplines have been validated by underlying statistics or research. DNA testing can allow one to identify people and connect them to objects using statistics and population frequencies. That doesn't exist for things like hair or fingerprints or bite marks. It turns out the DNA showed that one of the other sailors on the boat actually was the source of the DNA left in the victim's bite marks and the rape kit that was collected. They not only convicted an innocent person, but missed the guilty person who went on to commit other crimes and had died in prison by the time Keith Harward was exonerated. He later spoke in front of the National Forensics Commission in favor of having more standards for forensics, that you should be asking whether there's a research base for something before you use it in court, potentially to sentence someone to death. He was not sentenced to death, but he was initially sentenced to death. His trial got reversed on some kind of jury instruction-related ground, and then spent 33 years serving a life in prison type sentence in Virginia. But just to highlight how many other ways forensics can go wrong and do go wrong, including for some of the reasons we've heard about tonight, that crime labs aren't super well funded, they don't have great resources, but also some of the underlying disciplines that they use aren't well validated. This is the well-known case of Kenny Waters. His sister Betty Ann Waters actually put herself through high school, college, and law school so she could get a law degree and free her brother, who she was sure was innocent. She was right. All along, there's a movie where Hilary Swank plays her in a movie called Conviction, which I recommend. All along, before even getting the DNA, she was wondering, like, where are the fingerprints in this case? The police report mentioned fingerprints. Like, why couldn't they clear him using fingerprints? Well, there actually were prints taken from the scene of this murder in small-town Massachusetts. The prints did exclude him if you looked at them carefully. And all along, there was forensics that weren't carefully examined that could have pointed law enforcement away from him early on. Instead, he spent many years in prison, just like Keith Harward did. Another common factor in these cases, this is a researcher named E.T.L. Dror who's done a lot of work, along with a lot of other people these days, on cognitive biases. People at crime labs are typically not independent scientists who are looking at only the relevant facts and doing tests in a sort of lab condition type setting. Many of them are working at law enforcement labs. They report to law enforcement. They will be hearing things from law enforcement, like, we've got a biter on our hands, like, look what happened with his girlfriend, or this guy confessed, like, you don't really need to look at those fingerprints carefully. We've seen any number of cases in which police put pressure, or just there's a sort of a team mentality that your goal is to call matches here. We don't report statistics, we don't report uncertainty, we don't talk about the limitations of our disciplines, we call matches for law enforcement. That was a traditional culture, it's changing, and many more people with science backgrounds are doing this work, and hopefully that, there has been some progress and will be more. We also expect, and I'll just quickly wrap up, that judges would keep things out of court if it's unscientific. Judges are supposed to do that. They're supposed to look at the reliability of an expert before allowing them to take the stand. Typically what judges have done, though, is sort of referred to themselves and said, as judges, we've let fingerprints in for 100 years. We've been letting in bite mark testimony for decades now. That's good enough. We rely on other judges. There are serious problems with quality controls at these labs. We can talk about how these labs don't have the protections that a clinical lab would have. Spot checking, proficiency testing, the kind of things that could catch mistakes when they happen. I'll stop there, and thank you very much.
All right, it's time for Q&A about the legal side of forensic science. We've got one right over here. Our first question.
So I know you talked about fighting the implicit biases in the forensics. How do you fight that in the law as well for people who have been convicted, have objective scientific evidence come forward that exonerates them, but maybe the appeals court or whoever doesn't want to overturn the original verdict. So we know there are people who have been exonerated who are still sitting in jail for these crimes. How do you fight that piece of it?
Well, yeah, they haven't been exonerated if they're still in prison, unfortunately. It's not easy to bring a claim of innocence in this country, and it's not even necessarily even a cognitive bias. It's actually just legal standards that make it very hard to bring in new evidence once there's been a final conviction. Many states, North Carolina is one of them, have passed laws trying to open up some new avenues to bringing in new evidence of innocence. But like to get a pardon from a governor, it can take many, many, many years. North Carolina is the only state in the country that has an innocence commission, where there's like a government body that's supposed to investigate old cases and make recommendations that convictions be overturned. It needs more resources, like lots of things in government need more resources. Some other countries have done that larger scale, like we should investigate potential wrongful convictions just like we investigate new crimes, particularly since in many of these situations there is a culprit out there who is not behind bars. But it's a big problem, and it makes it all the more important to also obviously get evidence right before someone's convicted, because it is very, very difficult to overturn a conviction.
All right, other questions? We've got one. We'll go to the back, and then we'll come up here to the front.
So I was wondering, with the judges, they have some, bias in the things they permitted before, but there's also some bias that comes from just like the jury with watching TV and all the TV programs, having the expert say, oh, it's absolutely this bite mark. Would you say that should be combated with the people, saying this is the thing?
So I do a lot of mock jury research, and at this point I've surveyed tens of thousands of lay people, placing them in the position of jurors, showing them different versions of evidence. What we've seen is there isn't a problem in this country of people uncritically accepting science, for better or for worse. People don't necessarily trust experts in this country. But that said, if someone comes before you and says, I'm trained, I have expertise, I can look at these prints or these hairs or these bullet casings and call it a match. People tend to accept them at their word, but they do want to know, well, how good is this person who says they are an expert? So when we've done studies and given people information to say that, look, there have been some validation studies done, there have been some studies looking at the reliability of fingerprint work, and this is what we know about the error rates. People react very strongly to that. Or if you tell them that, look, this expert has been proficiency tested, which in real life they really aren't, even at accredited labs. They're kind of bogus and very simple, minimal tests. But if you told someone about a demanding test that someone was given and you knew how good they are at the thing they say they're an expert at, jurors really react to that. They want to know, how good is this expert? They don't normally hear that in court, which is a problem. But we haven't found any sort of impact of watching CSI-related shows or any of those kinds of things. If anything, though, what the problem is that people just sort of assume that you can do this matchmaking, that you can connect objects to people or to weapons or whatever without qualification, because they've never heard that there's any particular unreliability. They don't realize that there are subjective elements to all these analyses, and they're not told that in court.
All right, last question coming from the lady in the pink right here.
Okay, so you've talked a lot about inconsistencies in original cases, but my question is, on what basis can the case of an imprisoned person be reopened? What stops someone who is actually guilty from saying their case needs to be reconsidered?
So someone could try to reopen their case. It's very, very difficult. So normally, innocence, even strong evidence of innocence is not enough to reopen a case. You have to show that there is, in federal court, a constitutional violation. In most state courts, you also have to show some kind of other constitutional violation that happened at your trial in addition to innocence. The states that do have sort of writs of innocence require a very powerful showing of innocence to even sort of get in the door and make an argument that your case should be reopened. So it's really, really hard. It takes many years. Law schools like Duke have wrongful convictions clinics where they try to represent people who have powerful claims that they were wrongly convicted, and those cases can take 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And even where there is quite compelling evidence of innocence, it's a long road. For people where it's sort of the opposite. There's quite convincing evidence of their guilt. There are still sometimes errors that they can address, like there can be errors in sentencing, where you did the crime, but you were supposed to get a 3-year sentence and not a 6-year sentence. So there are some situations where those errors can be addressed, not really very easily either, but that is a possibility. And there are also cases of people who suffered some constitutional error at their trial. If there's evidence of guilt, courts will often say the constitutional error is harmless, doesn't matter, we're convinced you're guilty, and so even if we're supposed to remedy constitutional errors, you don't get a new trial. It's very hard to get a new trial in this country.
All right, folks, give it up for Brendan Garrett.